The moment we entered Willow Creek, the atmosphere changed, as if the air itself had decided to turn against us. The fog wasn't natural. It moved with purpose, curling around our feet and climbing up the skeletal trees like living tendrils. The only sound was the crunch of gravel underfoot, muffled and distant, like a memory we didn't want to revisit. My pulse quickened as I glanced at the others. Their faces mirrored my unease, but none of us said anything. We couldn't. The main street stretched before us, a corridor of crumbling buildings and shattered glass. Signs dangled precariously, the wind whispering through their rusted hinges. The diner, once bustling with life, now stood hollow, its windows smeared with grime. The flickering neon sign still read "Open," but the emptiness behind it felt like a cruel joke. We'd been lured back by the same message, cryptic and chilling. They never left, neither can you. It had arrived in unmarked envelopes. The handwriting, eerily familiar but unplaceable. Ignoring it wasn't an option. Some invisible pull had dragged us here, even when every instinct screamed to stay away. As we ventured deeper, the fog thickened, carrying a metallic tang that clung to my tongue. My gaze landed on the pharmacy. Its door, ajar, creaked faintly, beckoning like an invitation to something I didn't want to meet. I couldn't resist. My hand reached out, trembling, and pushed it open wider. The sound echoed like a scream in the oppressive silence. Inside, the shelves were overturned, their contents spilled and decayed. Medicine bottles lay shattered, their labels peeling like old skin. The smell of rot was overpowering. My stomach churned, but something else grabbed my attention. A trail of dark stains leading to the back room. They weren't old enough to blend with the decay. They glistened. I hesitated, but my legs moved anyway, each step heavier than the last. The others didn't follow. My ears didn't follow. It was as if the town itself had rooted them in place. I felt their eyes on my back, but they didn't speak. Maybe they couldn't. The door to the back room was slightly ajar, and the trail of stains disappeared beneath it. I nudged it open, my breath hitching. The room was small, its walls lined with cabinets that hung crookedly. Hey, bejevelmas, kapikulele. And the night stood thou. In the center stood a chair, its wooden surface stained dark. Straps dangled from the armrests, frayed and worn. Something wet pooled beneath it, reflecting the dim light filtering through the cracked ceiling. But it wasn't the chair that held my attention. It was what hung above it. A mirror, shattered into jagged fragments, each piece catching and distorting my reflection. And then, for the briefest moment, I saw something that wasn't me. A figure, tall and gaunt, its face obscured, its hand reaching toward the glass. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my throat. When I looked again, the figure was gone, but the shards continued to glint with malice, as if they'd enjoyed my reaction. I wanted to run, to scream, but the weight of the room pressed down on me, pinning me to the spot. The air was thick, suffocating. Behind me, A sudden noise, soft and wet, like something being dragged. I spun around, my body tensing as adrenaline surged. The trail of stains had extended, spreading like veins, pulsating faintly as though alive. They stretched toward the open door, leading back to the street. The others must have noticed. But when I stepped outside, they weren't there. Panic surged. The fog was thicker now, swallowing the town in its hungry embrace. The streetlights flickered sporadically, casting fleeting shadows that danced and twisted. I called their names, but the sound was swallowed by the fog, leaving only an oppressive silence. My hands trembled as I clutched the edge of the pharmacy's doorway, afraid to venture further, yet terrified to stay. That's when I saw the first glimpse of movement. A figure at the end of the street, standing unnaturally still, its head tilted, as if observing me. It was too far to make out its features, but its presence was suffocating. Slowly, deliberately, it raised an arm and pointed at me, and the fog seemed to tighten around my chest. My breath came in shallow gasps as I backed away, my feet stumbling over the uneven ground. The figure didn't move, but its shadow stretched toward me, impossibly long. Reaching with claw-like fingers, I turned and ran, the fog clawing at my skin. The town's decayed buildings closing in like a predator circling its prey. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the woods. I didn't stop until I reached the woods. The trees loomed above me, their branches gnarled and twisted, blocking out what little light remained. I pressed my back against a trunk, my chest heaving. My eyes darted around, searching for any sign of the others. But the woods offered no answers. And then, just as I thought the figure had disappeared, a sound cut through the stillness, a low, guttural whisper. It came from the trees, from the ground, from everywhere. Words I couldn't understand, but their intent was clear. I wasn't alone. The forest wasn't empty. The shadows moved again, and I knew I had made a mistake coming back to Willow Creek. But it wasn't just the town that was haunted. Something far worse was haunting us. Something that had been waiting, and now it had me exactly where it wanted. The forest pressed against me, alive with sounds that weren't supposed to exist. My breaths were shallow, and my pulse thudded loudly in my ears. Somewhere, far deeper than my immediate panic, I felt the nagging weight of something I couldn't name. It wasn't just fear. It was recognition. This place knew me, and I hated that it did. The whispering hadn't stopped. The words were unintelligible, strung together like a chant in a language I didn't recognize. My eyes scanned the forest floor, searching for anything to ground me, but the trees blurred into one another, their gnarled roots twisting into shapes that felt deliberate. Shadows slithered between them, moving with a purpose I dared not dwell on. Something cracked to my left, a sharp, deliberate snap of a twig. My body froze, instinct paralyzing my limbs. Slowly, I turned my head. At first, there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of trees and shadows. Then I saw it. A figure crouched low, just beyond the reach of the dim moonlight. Its shape was human, but it was wrong, too angular and stiff, like a puppet forced into unnatural poses. It was watching me. I could feel it. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My throat was dry, the air stolen from my lungs. I took a step back, and the figure moved, mirroring my retreat. Its limbs jerked in staccato motions, and I swear I heard the soft creak of wood as it shifted. Another step back, and I felt the bark of the tree behind me press against my spine. There was nowhere to go. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me in a cacophony of voices that seemed to echo inside my skull. The figure stood, its full height monstrous, its head tilted to one side, as if studying me, and then it took a step forward. The ground beneath its feet pulsed, the leaves darkening where it tread. "Stay away," I finally managed, my voice cracking like brittle glass. It didn't stop. I needed to move. Pigaule. Rus. Esservis. My legs obeyed this time, carrying me deeper into the forest. I ran blindly, branches clawing at my face and arms, the whispers chasing me. The air grew colder, sharper, biting at my skin. The ground sloped downward, and I stumbled, tumbling hard onto the damp earth. Pain shot through my knees, but I scrambled to my feet, refusing to look back. Ahead, a faint light flickered, a lantern swaying gently. Relief surged through me. Unsettling. Arnold's bear. Ideal. Someone else was here. Maybe they could help. I sprinted toward it, the forest blurring around me. The whispers didn't fade, but they seemed to hesitate, as if the light held some power they couldn't breach. When I reached the lantern, I saw it was hanging from a rusted hook driven into the trunk of a massive tree. Its flame was weak, trembling against the weight of the darkness. Hennant, Otuan tablet door. Beneath it lay something that made my stomach churn. A circle carved into the earth, filled with symbols that looked older than the town itself. Blood, dark and sticky, pooled within the grooves. And in the center of the circle was a name. My name. Morni. Shubide. The air grew heavier, pressing down on my chest. My knees buckled, and I fell to the ground, my hands digging into the dirt. I wanted to run, to deny what I was seeing, but the symbols seemed to pulse, their glow dim but insistent. The whispers coalesced into a single voice, low and guttural, speaking directly into my mind. You were always meant to return. The lantern's light flickered, and then it went out, plunging me into suffocating darkness. Panic exploded inside me. I clawed at the ground, desperate to stand, but something cold wrapped around my wrist, pulling me back. It wasn't a hand. It was something far worse. Its texture like brittle twigs that snapped and reformed with every movement. I screamed, thrashing against its grip. but it was relentless, dragging me toward the circle. The symbols glowed brighter, their light burning into my vision. The voice grew louder, chanting now, a rhythmic cadence that resonated in my bones. The shadows around me seemed to solidify, closing in, and then, abruptly, the pressure lifted. The grip on my wrist vanished, and I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. The forest was silent again, unnervingly so. I pushed myself up, trembling, and glanced at the circle. It was empty. The blood, the symbols, even the lantern, gone as if they had never been there. But my name lingered, burned into the ground. I staggered to my feet, my knees threatening to give out. I needed to get out of the forest, back to the main road, back to anything that felt real. But as I turned, I realized with sinking dread that I didn't know which direction to go. The trees stretched endlessly, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the sky. The trail I had followed was gone, swallowed by the forest's hunger. A sound behind me, a low, dragging scrape. I didn't look. I couldn't. I ran, the ground shifting beneath my feet, as if the forest itself was trying to trap me. The whispers returned, softer this time, almost mocking. They were in my head, under my skin, guiding me to something I couldn't escape. And then I saw it. A clearing ahead, bathed in pale moonlight. In its center stood a figure, taller and more solid than the one before. Its back was to me, but its presence was undeniable. I stopped, every instinct screaming at me to turn around. But I couldn't. The whispers were louder now, and they came from the figure. It turned slowly, its face obscured by shadows, but its eyes burned like embers, locking onto mine. It raised a hand, beckoning. The forest didn't just watch me, it breathed. Every time I tried to catch my breath, it felt like the trees leaned closer, their branches tangling above to block out even the faintest light. My feet were caked with mud, my jeans torn from unseen thorns. But it wasn't just the terrain that tore at me. It was the overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. Something followed, and worse, it wanted me to know. Every noise became a threat, the rustling of leaves, the groan of shifting trees. It all blended into an unrelenting symphony of dread. But it was the whispers that truly burrowed into my mind. They weren't distant anymore. They were immediate, too close, each syllable brushing against the inside of my skull like a shadowy caress. "Leave me alone," I muttered, barely audible over my labored breathing. My voice cracked, weak and hollow, in the suffocating silence that followed. The forest didn't care about my demands. It never did. I stumbled onto what looked like a narrow path. The dirt beneath my feet pressed flat, as if hundreds had walked it before. The air here was colder, sharper, biting against my skin, even through my jacket. It felt like the forest wanted me to walk this path, as though it had shaped itself for my convenience and my destruction. I didn't want to follow it, but my options were non-existent. Staying still wasn't an option. Value. Yeah. Not with whatever was back there. Each step forward felt like a betrayal of instinct. My gut screamed at me to turn around, to run in any direction but forward. But the moment I glanced back, I saw nothing. Nothing. And yet, everything. The shadows seemed to ripple as if they were alive, watching, waiting for me to falter. And I couldn't give them that satisfaction. The path sloped downward, leading me into a dense fog that clung to the ground like a living thing. My shoes sank into the earth, the mud sucking at them with every step. The further I went, the thicker the fog became, until I could barely see my own hands. But it wasn't just the fog obscuring my vision. It was the overwhelming sensation that the forest itself was closing in, narrowing, suffocating. And then I saw it, a structure, barely visible through the mist. It looked old, ancient even, its wooden beams weathered and sagging under the weight of years. It wasn't a house, it was something smaller, more primitive. A shack, maybe, or an abandoned hunting cabin. The windows were shattered, the door hanging ajar, as if it had been left in a hurry. The whispers surged as I approached, louder now, more insistent. They weren't just random anymore. They formed words, phrases, an eerie chant that vibrated in my chest. I didn't want to go inside. Every fiber of my being told me to stay away, to turn back. But where would I go? There was no escape. Not in this place. So I stepped forward, the wooden porch creaking under my weight. The door swung open, wider, its hinges groaning like a wounded animal. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of decay. The floorboards were littered with debris, broken glass, splintered wood, and something darker, wetter. My eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the broken windows, and I saw symbols etched into the walls. They weren't just random scratches. They were deliberate, intricate, pulsating faintly, as though they were alive. I wanted to leave, to run. But something rooted me in place. It was the same sensation I felt in the circle. The oppressive weight of something far beyond my understanding. My name was here. I could feel it, though I hadn't yet seen it. The whispers grew deafening, and then they stopped. Silence fell, heavier than the whispers had ever been. And in that silence, I heard a sound, a low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere deeper within the shack. I stepped back instinctively, my heart pounding so loudly, I was sure whatever was in there could hear it. But the growl didn't come closer. It stayed where it was, a warning more than a threat. I turned toward the doorway, ready to bolt, but froze. Standing there, blocking my only exit, was a figure. It was humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong. Its arms were too long, its neck bent at an unnatural angle. Its face, if it could be called that, was featureless, save for two hollow sockets where eyes should have been. It tilted its head, as though curious, and then it spoke. Its voice wasn't loud, but it filled the space completely, vibrating in my bones. You are where you belong. I couldn't move. My body refused to obey. The figure stepped closer, and the symbols on the walls flared to life, their light bathing the room in an eerie glow. The whispers returned, this time coming from the figure itself. They weren't just words, they were commands, invading my mind, forcing me to remember things I didn't want to. A name came to me, unbidden, not my name. Its name. It had always been with me, hadn't it? Watching, waiting for the moment I would return. And now that I was here, there was no leaving. The figure raised a hand, skeletal and sharp, and pointed to the floor. My gaze followed, and I saw what I hadn't noticed before. A trapdoor, its edges glowing faintly with the same light as the symbols. Down, the figure said, its voice like broken glass. I didn't want to obey, but my legs moved on their own. The trapdoor creaked open with a sound that made my teeth ache, revealing a staircase descending into complete darkness. The air that wafted up was colder than anything I had ever felt, and it carried a smell that turned my stomach. I looked back at the figure, hoping for some reprieve. But it was gone. The doorway was empty. The shack silent once more. Shook, but the whispers hadn't left. They were below, waiting for me, with no other choice. I descended into the dark. Descending into the darkness, I felt the air grow heavier with every step. Each plank of the staircase creaked under my weight, echoing far louder than it should have in such a confined space. My heart pounded in sync with each step, a relentless drumbeat in my chest. The faint light from the trapdoor above grew dimmer with every second, until it disappeared entirely, leaving me in suffocating blackness. The whispers returned, faint at first, weaving through the silence like a gentle breeze, but they weren't soft for long. Soon they built, louder and more insistent, burrowing into my mind with their incoherent chants. They were all around me, above me, below me, everywhere. I couldn't tell if they were guiding me or mocking me, but I pressed on, my hand trailing the damp, rough walls to keep myself from losing balance. I reached the bottom, my foot hitting solid ground that felt cold and uneven, like stone. The whispers receded momentarily, replaced by an ominous, pulsating sound. It wasn't loud, but I could feel it reverberating through the floor and into my bones. I wanted to scream, but my throat closed around the words. Instead, I forced my feet forward, step by agonizing step, until I could make out faint outlines in the darkness. The room wasn't large, but its dimensions felt warped, impossible. Walls that should have met at right angles curved unnaturally, making it hard to tell where one ended and the other began. Symbols, like those in the shack above, covered every surface, etched deep into the stone. and pulsating with a faint red glow. The light didn't illuminate the room so much as it hinted at its depths, leaving shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. In the center of the room was an altar. It was crudely constructed, its surface made of rough-hewn stone, stained dark with what I prayed wasn't blood. Surrounding it were objects, relics maybe, each more grotesque than the last. A charred doll, its face melted beyond recognition. A rusted knife, its edge jagged and cruel, and a single withered flower, so blackened that it seemed to absorb the faint light around it. I wanted to run, to scramble back up the stairs and out of this nightmare, but my legs wouldn't obey. The whispers surged again, louder this time, more commanding. They weren't just sounds anymore. They were words, though I couldn't understand their language. Yet, somehow, I felt their meaning deep in my chest. They were summoning something. Even or someone. A shadow flickered across the room, darting just beyond the edge of my vision. My breath caught as I spun around, searching for the source. There was nothing, just the oppressive emptiness of the room and the suffocating hum of the whispers. And then the altar changed. The symbols etched into its surface flared bright red, casting the room into a sudden, violent glow. The shadows came alive, writhing and twisting across the walls like living creatures. The whispers reached a crescendo, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. And then silence. The sudden quiet was worse than the noise. Every day. It pressed down on me, heavy and stifling, as if the air had been sucked out of the room. I took a shaky step backward, my foot brushing against something soft. I looked down, and my stomach turned. It was a body. The figure was curled on the ground, its limbs contorted at unnatural angles. I couldn't tell if it was human. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over a skeletal frame. Its eyes, if they were eyes, were sunken pits of darkness, staring unseeing into the void. But the worst part was its mouth, twisted into a grotesque grin that seemed too wide, too deliberate. I stumbled back, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a scream. But before I could move further, the body twitched. Its head turned slowly, impossibly, until it was facing me. The grin widened, and from its gaping mouth came a sound that wasn't a sound at all. A low, guttural noise that rumbled deep in my chest, vibrating through my very soul. "You came," it said, its voice a rasping whisper that seemed to echo off the walls. Why? I couldn't answer. My legs refused to move, my mind blank with terror. The figure began to rise, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on invisible strings. It towered over me, its empty eyes boring into mine. "You were called," it continued, stepping closer. "You answered. I didn't." The words barely escaped my lips before the figure tilted its head, silencing me with a single chilling gesture. "Your name is written," it said, raising one skeletal hand to point at the altar. "Your place is chosen." I followed its gesture, my eyes locking onto the altar. There, scrawled in the center of the stone, was my name, freshly carved, the letters glistening with what could only be blood. Panic surged through me, breaking the paralysis. I turned and ran, bolting for the stairs. The whispers exploded into laughter, cruel and mocking, chasing me as I stumbled up the steps. The figure's voice followed, low and menacing. "You cannot run from what is written." The staircase seemed endless, stretching on far longer than it had on the way down. My lungs burned, my legs screaming in protest, but I didn't stop. Finally, I reached the trapdoor, shoving it open and collapsing onto the floor of the shack. The whispers stopped abruptly as I slammed the door shut behind me, cutting off the darkness below. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was heavy, laden with the knowledge that whatever I had just encountered wasn't finished with me. The moment I slammed the trapdoor shut, the shack felt alive with an oppressive stillness. I pressed my back against the wooden boards, chest heaving as I tried to convince myself that I was safe, but I wasn't. The air around me felt charged, as if holding its breath, waiting. I could feel it, a presence, something unseen but unmistakably real, watching from the shadows. The symbols carved into the shack's walls glowed faintly now, as if feeding off the fear coursing through me. Their light danced eerily, shifting in a way that made it impossible to tell if they were static carvings or moving entities. I averted my eyes, focusing instead on the ground beneath me, but even that offered no solace. A dark stain, irregular and spreading, crept closer to where I sat, its edges shimmering faintly like oil on water. Then, a sound, soft, rhythmic, like footsteps, muffled by a thick carpet. It came from the direction of the trapdoor. My stomach twisted as I realized the faint, wet noise wasn't fading. It was growing louder. Something was coming up the stairs. I scrambled to my feet, heart hammering against my ribs as I scanned the room for an escape. The shack offered nothing but its warped, rotting walls and a single grimy window. I didn't care. I ran to the window, using my elbow to shatter the glass, the shards slicing into my skin as I clawed at the frame to widen the opening. The sharp pain barely registered over the thundering terror in my chest. Behind me, the footsteps stopped. I froze, breath caught in my throat, every nerve screaming at me to run. But something, some terrible primal instinct, made me turn around. The trapdoor was open, its wooden lid propped at an angle. Darkness bled out from the opening, impossibly black, consuming what little light the shack had to offer. And then it emerged. The figure that crawled out wasn't human. Not anymore. Its limbs bent wrong, the angles grotesque and unnatural, like a marionette with its strings tangled. The grin remained, impossibly wide, and filled with jagged teeth that didn't belong in any living thing. Its eyes, or the voids where its eyes should have been, locked onto me, dragging my gaze into their endless blackness. "You can't leave," it rasped, its voice a guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You are part of this now." Fooch! I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the jagged glass at my feet. My mind screamed for escape, but the figure moved faster than I thought possible. In the blink of an eye, it was inches away from me, its breath foul and freezing against my face. Before I could react, its hand shot out, gripping my wrist with an inhuman strength. Pain shot through my arm as its grip tightened, the bony fingers digging into my skin like claws. And my vision blurred, not from tears, but from the overwhelming, suffocating pressure that seemed to emanate from the thing holding me. And then it spoke again, low and deliberate. "The altar called you. You can't deny it." The words ignited something inside me. Anger, desperation, defiance. I twisted my body, using every ounce of strength I had to break free from its grasp. My wrist slipped from its grip, and I lunged for the shattered window, ignoring the glass that tore at my arms and legs as I squeezed through. Outside, the air was cold, biting against my bloodied skin as I stumbled away from the shack. My vision swam, my ears ringing with the echoes of the creature's voice. I didn't know where I was going. My only thought was to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. The forest around me was suffocating, its gnarled trees pressing in from every side. The moonlight barely pierced through the canopy, leaving me to navigate by instinct alone. And my bare feet tore against the uneven ground, but I couldn't stop. The whispers had returned, not from the shack, but from the forest itself, slithering through the darkness like venom. I don't know how long I ran. Time had lost all meaning, the forest stretching endlessly in every direction. My lungs burned, my legs threatening to give out with every step. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, the trees thinned, revealing the edge of the woods. There, in the clearing, was something I hadn't expected. My car. It sat where I'd left it, the driver's door ajar, as if waiting for me. Relief flooded through me, pushing back the terror just enough to propel me forward. I threw myself into the car, slamming the door behind me and fumbling for the keys. But the engine wouldn't start. The whispers grew louder, circling the car, pressing against the windows like a living force. My hands trembled as I turned the key again and again, the engine sputtering but refusing to roar to life. Panic clawed at my chest, my vision blurring as the shadows outside began to shift, coalescing into a shape. It was here. The figure stood just beyond the windshield, its grin wider than ever, its eyes locked onto mine. Slowly, it raised one hand, pressing it against the glass. the surface frosted over at its touch. A spiderweb of ice spreading outward from where its fingers met the glass. "You can't run," it whispered, its voice penetrating the car as though the glass wasn't there. "You belong to us now." The engine roared to life. Without thinking, I slammed my foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, its tires spinning against the loose dirt before finding traction. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch, as the car sped toward it. For a moment, I thought I'd hit it, but it disappeared, vanishing into the darkness as if it had never been there. I didn't stop driving, not until the forest was a distant memory, and the first hints of dawn began to break on the horizon. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached, but I didn't care. I couldn't let go. I couldn't stop. The whispers were gone, the shadows receding, but the terror remained, because even as the daylight grew stronger, I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still with me, watching, waiting, and somewhere deep inside, I knew it wasn't over. Driving felt like an act of desperation, each mile pulling me further from the forest, but closer to a silence I couldn't trust. The road was a desolate ribbon of asphalt, stretching endlessly ahead, flanked by skeletal trees that seemed to reach for the car as it sped past. My hands clenched the steering wheel, knuckles white, the faint hum of the engine, the only sound anchoring me to reality. Yet even in motion, I couldn't shake the sensation of being trapped. Every shadow cast by the roadside felt alive. Every flicker of my headlights revealing shapes that melted away the moment I tried to focus on them. The creature, or whatever it was, had left its mark, not just on my wrist, where faint bruises now bloomed in the shape of its grasp, but deeper in my mind. Its voice still lingered, its words an echo I couldn't escape. "You belong to us now." I shook my head violently, as though I could physically dislodge the memory. The car veered slightly, tires skidding on the shoulder before I righted the wheel. My breath came in ragged gasps, my pulse a relentless drumbeat in my ears. The air inside the car felt heavy, oppressive, as though I weren't alone. I refused to glance at the rearview mirror. I didn't want to confirm what I already feared, that the figure was there, silently waiting. A sign loomed ahead, its reflective surface catching the glow of my headlights. West Ridge Motel, 5 miles ahead. The letters seemed to shimmer, their invitation both a promise and a threat. Logic told me to keep driving, to put as much distance as I could between myself and that cursed shack. But exhaustion dragged at my limbs, my thoughts unraveling with each passing second. I needed rest, just a moment to catch my breath and figure out what to do next. I pulled into the motel parking lot just as the first hints of dawn began to bleed across the horizon. The place looked like it had been forgotten by time. A squat, L-shaped building with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign that buzzed faintly in the still morning air. There were no other cars in the lot, no sign of life, It should have felt empty, but instead, it felt expectant, like the motel had been waiting for me. The woman at the front desk barely glanced up as I entered, her face pale and waxen in the dim light. She slid a key across the counter, without a word, her eyes never meeting mine. Something about her movements seemed off, too precise, as though she were imitating what a person should look like. I didn't linger to find out. Clutching the key, I made my way to the assigned room, the number 6 etched into the brass plate on the door. The room was as unremarkable as I'd expected. A single bed with a faded floral bedspread, a small TV perched on a rickety stand, and curtains that didn't quite close all the way. The air smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic, like rust or blood. I locked the door behind me, sliding the chain across for good measure, and sank onto the bed, my body trembling with exhaustion. But rest didn't come. As I lay there, the oppressive silence of the room pressed against me, suffocating. I turned on the TV, desperate for some noise to fill the void. But the screen only displayed static. The sound grated against my nerves, but I couldn't bring myself to turn it off. It was better than silence. Minutes stretched into hours, or at least it felt that way. My mind played tricks on me, the edges of the room seeming to ripple like heat waves. The bruises on my wrist throbbed in time with my heartbeat, the faint outline of the creature's grip a constant reminder. I told myself I was imagining things, that the shadows creeping along the walls were nothing more than tricks of the dim light. But then I heard it, a faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from the bathroom. I froze, every muscle locking in place, as my ears strained to confirm what I already knew. The tapping continued, unhurried, as though whoever, or whatever, was making it had all the time in the world. My breath hitched as the realization settled over me. I hadn't checked the bathroom when I entered the room. The tapping stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening, a void that swallowed every sound. Then, the bathroom door creaked open, its hinges groaning like a dying breath. My body moved before my mind could catch up. I bolted from the bed, grabbing the chair from the small desk and wedging it under the doorknob in a desperate attempt to barricade myself in. My heart pounded as I backed away, every instinct screaming that the flimsy chair wouldn't hold. The bathroom light flickered on, casting a sickly yellow glow that spilled into the room, and then a shadow moved. It wasn't the creature, not exactly. This thing was smaller, hunched, its limbs trembling as it stepped into view. It wore the tattered remains of what looked like a hotel uniform, the name tag hanging askew on its chest. But its face, oh God, its face was wrong. The features were melted, as though someone had pressed their thumbs into wet clay, the eyes uneven and too large, the mouth stretched unnaturally wide. It didn't speak. It didn't have to. The moment its gaze locked onto mine, I felt it, a cold, invasive pressure in my mind, as though it were peeling back the layers of my thoughts. I stumbled backward, my legs giving out as I collapsed onto the bed. The creature took a step forward, its movements jerky, marionette-like. The chair under the doorknob splintered. Before I could react, the creature lunged, its grotesque hands outstretched. I threw myself to the side, narrowly avoiding its grasp, as it crashed onto the bed where I'd been moments before. I scrambled to my feet, my vision swimming as adrenaline surged through me. The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in as I staggered toward the door. My fingers fumbled with the chain lock. The sound of the creature behind me growing louder. Finally, the lock gave way, and I flung the door open, stumbling into the cold morning air. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My only thought was to run, to put as much distance as I could between myself and that room, that creature, that motel. But as I reached the edge of the parking lot, something made me stop. I turned, my breath catching in my throat as I looked back at the motel. The neon sign flickered once, twice, and then went dark. And in the sudden darkness I saw them, shadows, dozens of them, standing motionless in the windows of the other rooms, watching. Goul, smoothedel, egdulenia, al, batishakstegi, waiting. The shadows from the motel windows had burned into my mind. They weren't just passive observers. Their presence was a declaration. I could feel their stares burrowing into me. Even as I drove away, the faint orange glow of the rising sun should have been a comfort, but it wasn't. It cast long, jagged shadows across the highway, distorting every tree and roadside sign into warped silhouettes that looked far too human. My hands gripped the wheel tighter. The weight on my chest hadn't lifted. If anything, it had grown heavier, pressing down with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. The bruises on my wrist throbbed in time with my pulse, and my thoughts were like shattered glass, fragments that wouldn't fit together no matter how hard I tried. The highway stretched ahead, endless and empty. Signs of civilization became sparser with each passing mile. No houses, no towns, just wilderness on either side. I told myself this was good. Distance was what I needed. But deep down, I knew it didn't matter. Whatever had marked me at that motel wasn't bound by distance. Lee, I could still feel its grip on my wrist, on my mind, on something deeper I couldn't name. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, its red numbers glowing dimly. It read 7:07 a.m. But the seconds didn't change. My stomach churned as I realized the clock wasn't frozen. It was repeating the same minute over and over again. The digital hum of the car radio, which had been silent since I'd started driving, crackled to life. A faint, distorted voice whispering just beneath the static. I turned the volume knob, hoping to drown it out. But the voice grew louder, its words becoming clearer. You can't outrun it. You belong to us now. I slammed my hand against the radio, and the voice cut out, replaced by an eerie silence. My heart was racing, and for a brief, irrational moment, I considered pulling over and abandoning the car entirely. But where would I go? On foot, I'd be even more vulnerable. Even more vulnerable. The steering wheel felt slick in my hands. Though I hadn't been sweating, my gaze darted down, and I froze. My palms were smeared with something dark and wet. Blood. But it wasn't mine. I hadn't injured myself, and yet the substance was unmistakable, its metallic scent filling the car. Panic surged through me. I wiped my hands against my jeans, leaving streaks of crimson that wouldn't fade no matter how much I rubbed. The smell of the blood grew stronger, overwhelming, until it was all I could taste, all I could breathe. I swerved the car to the side of the road, throwing it into park before stumbling out. The cold morning air hit me like a slap, but it did little to ground me. I doubled over, gasping for breath, the blood now dripping from my fingertips onto the dirt. My reflection in the driver's side window caught my attention, and I turned, dreading what I'd see. It wasn't me. The face staring back was mine. But it wasn't at the same time. The eyes were sunken, hollow, and black as the void. My mouth was stretched unnaturally wide, a grin that shouldn't have been possible. And you turn no risers. The reflection moved of its own accord, pressing its palm against the glass, smearing it with blood from the inside. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet and landing hard on the ground. My head hit the dirt, and for a moment, the world spun wildly. When I sat up, the reflection was gone. The window was clean, as though nothing had ever been there. The sound of footsteps on gravel pulled my attention back to the road. Someone was standing behind the car. No, not someone. It was the creature from the motel, the one with the melted face and the jerking, puppet-like movements. But this time, it wasn't alone. Others stood with it, their forms barely distinguishable from the shadows cast by the trees. All of them were watching me, their heads tilted unnaturally, like they were waiting for something. I scrambled to my feet, fumbling with the car door. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely grip the handle. By the time I managed to get back inside and lock the doors, the figures had moved closer. They didn't walk. They simply appeared, one moment far away, the next right at the edge of the car's headlights. The engine roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas. The car shot forward, the figures vanishing into the trees as the tires screeched against the asphalt. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My focus was on the road ahead, the narrow strip of safety that separated me from whatever was lurking in the shadows. But the further I drove, the less real the world became. The trees on either side of the highway began to blur, their forms twisting and merging until they were indistinguishable from one another. The road itself seemed to ripple like water, and the horizon was swallowed by a darkness that no amount of sunlight could penetrate. And then I saw it, a familiar neon sign glowing faintly in the distance. West Ridge Motel. El Bar. Danulves. No, I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. That's not possible. But it was. Eerie. As the car approached, I saw the same peeling paint, the same flickering lights, the same emptiness. My heart sank as I realized the road had led me back. There was no escaping it. The car came to a stop in the parking lot, though I didn't remember pressing the brakes. The engine died, leaving me in silence. Silence. My hands gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, as I stared at the motel. The shadows in the windows were back, dozens of them, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. I knew I couldn't stay in the car. I knew I couldn't stay in the car. The shadows wouldn't let me. Slowly, I opened the door, my movements sluggish, as though I were wading through water. The air was thick, oppressive, carrying a faint, familiar whisper that I couldn't ignore. You can't outrun it. You belong to us now. As I stepped onto the cracked pavement, the shadows began to move, their forms spilling out of the windows like liquid smoke. They surrounded me, their whispers growing louder, overlapping, until they became a single, deafening roar. My vision blurred, and the world tilted. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the neon sign flickering one final time. Welcome home. No. The crossing. I didn't know when the road shifted. The Appalachian Trail had been predictable up until then. Sharp turns, dense canopies overhead, and the occasional wooden sign warning about wildlife. But somewhere, somehow, I had ended up on a stretch of asphalt that didn't belong to the world I recognized. The woods pressed in closer, darker. My GPS had gone blank an hour ago, and the radio hissed static, broken occasionally by faint whispers I convinced myself were nothing. The first sign something was wrong wasn't the road or the unnatural quiet. It was the silence in my head, the absence of thought. It was as if the closer I got to wherever I was going, the more my mind emptied, leaving room for something else to creep in. The town of Black Hollow came into view abruptly, like a secret being revealed all at once. A weathered wooden arch stretched over the entrance. The words, "Welcome to Black Hollow," carved into it in faded letters. Beyond the arch, the town stood frozen in time. Narrow streets, lined with crumbling Victorian houses, stretched into the distance. Rusted street lamps flickered weakly, casting uneven patches of yellow light that only deepened the shadows. I stopped my car in what seemed to be the center of the town, a small square dominated by a dry fountain. A statue of a woman holding an urn stood in the middle, her face cracked and peeling. Something about her gaze, though her eyes were blank stone, made my stomach churn. The air was heavy, almost viscous. Breathing felt like dragging syrup into my lungs. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to turn around and never look back, but my hands stayed glued to the steering wheel. I wasn't sure if it was fear or something more sinister keeping me there. Then I noticed the footprints. They were faint, barely visible on the cracked pavement, but fresh. They led from the fountain toward one of the houses on the far side of the square. I felt a pull. Irrational, insistent. I had to follow them. The house they led to was an old colonial with a sagging porch and windows like gaping mouths. The front door was ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness that seemed deeper than it should have been. My feet moved before I could convince myself otherwise, crunching over dead leaves and brittle twigs as I approached. Inside, the house smelled of rot and something metallic, like old blood. The hallway stretched impossibly long, lined with peeling wallpaper that seemed to shift in the corner of my vision. At the end of the hallway was a single door, closed but humming faintly, almost imperceptibly. I pushed it open. The room was small, bare, except for a table in the center and a single chair. On the table was an old leather-bound book, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. The room was so silent, I could hear the rapid thud of my own heartbeat. When I stepped closer to the table, the book flipped open on its own, its pages fluttering wildly before settling on a specific one. The words on the page were written in spidery handwriting, looping and frantic. My name was at the top. Pioli Dantezer Daten Bali. The floor beneath me shifted. The walls seemed to close in, the air thickening until it felt like the room itself was alive. I stumbled back, my eyes locked on the book as the words began to rearrange themselves, forming a message that burned itself into my mind. You are here because you deserve to be. The sound started then, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The shadows on the walls stretched and twisted, forming shapes that looked too human to be natural. The air grew colder, and I realized I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the spot, my body paralyzed by an unseen force. Then I saw it, the figure in the corner. It was hunched, its limbs elongated and wrong, its face obscured by the darkness that clung to it like a shroud. It moved toward me with a jerky, unnatural gait, its head tilting at impossible angles, as if it were studying me. I couldn't scream. The pressure in my chest was unbearable, my lungs refusing to cooperate. All I could do was watch as it approached, its hand, if you could call it that, reaching for me. The last thing I saw before everything went black was its face, or what I thought was its face. Empty sockets stared back at me, and its mouth was a gaping void filled with nothing but silence. And then I was gone. The crossing continued when I opened my eyes. I wasn't in the room anymore. The book, the shadows, the figure, they were gone. Instead, I found myself standing in the town square again, the dry fountain looming before me like a monument to something forgotten. The air was still heavy, pressing against my skin, and the world around me seemed muted, as if a fog had rolled in and stolen all sound. My head pounded, a relentless thrum that blurred the edges of my thoughts. I didn't remember walking back to the square. I didn't remember anything after the figure reached for me. But something had changed. The town wasn't as empty as it had been. The windows of the houses flickered with faint lights, and silhouettes moved behind the curtains. I couldn't make out faces or details, just the impression of shapes, human but wrong, their movements too fluid, too deliberate. Then came the laughter. It started soft, almost a whisper, curling through the air like smoke. It grew louder, closer, until it surrounded me, a cacophony of high-pitched giggles and deep guttural chuckles. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I spun around, searching for the source, but the square was empty. The silhouettes in the windows had stopped moving, frozen in place, like they were watching, waiting. Something wet and cold brushed against my arm. You delivered yellows. They need you. I jerked away, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing there, just the laughter, louder now, echoing in my skull. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but my feet carried me down the street, past the crumbling houses and rusted street lamps. The town stretched endlessly in every direction, a maze of identical streets and dead ends. My breath came in short, ragged gasps. The air too thick to fill my lungs. Everywhere I turned, the laughter followed, growing sharper, more malicious. It wasn't just laughter anymore. It was voices, whispering my name, hissing words I couldn't understand, but felt deep in my bones. I stumbled into an alleyway, my hands bracing against the rough brick walls as I tried to catch my breath. The whispers quieted, replaced by an eerie stillness that was somehow worse. That's when I saw her. She was standing at the far end of the alley, her back to me. Her hair was long and tangled, her clothes tattered and stained. She didn't move, didn't react to my presence, but I could feel her watching me, even without seeing her face. I wanted to call out, to ask her who she was, but my throat tightened, choking off the words. My feet refused to move, rooted to the spot, as if the alley itself was holding me in place. Slowly, she turned. Her face was a patchwork of decay and raw, glistening flesh. Her eyes sunken hollows that glowed faintly in the dim light. Her mouth stretched into a smile that was too wide, too sharp, the edges of her lips splitting open to reveal teeth that looked like shards of glass. "Why did you come here?" she whispered, her voice like the rustling of dead leaves. I couldn't answer. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. She stepped closer, her movements jerky, unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. "You were warned," she said, her voice growing louder, sharper. "But you didn't listen." Her hand shot out, clawed and skeletal. gripping my wrist with an icy strength that burned through my skin. Pain shot up my arm, and I gasped. The sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. Images flooded my mind. Visions of the town, the fountain, the book, and the figure in the room. They came in rapid flashes, disjointed and chaotic, each one more horrifying than the last. A voice, deep and resonant, echoed through the visions, repeating the same words over and over. "You cannot leave." The woman's grip tightened, and the world around me blurred, the alley dissolving into darkness. I was falling, weightless and unmoored, the voice chasing me into the void. When I landed, I was back in the square. The fountain stood before me, the statue's gaze more menacing than before. My wrist throbbed where the woman had grabbed me, the skin bruised and raw. The lights in the houses had gone out, and the silhouettes were gone. The laughter and whispers had ceased, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing and the faint hum of something unseen, something alive. The book was lying at my feet. Its pages were open, blank, but for a single word scrawled in the center: "Stay." I bent to pick it up, my hands trembling. But the moment my fingers touched the cover, the ground beneath me cracked and a hand shot out, clawed and dripping with darkness. I screamed, the sound tearing through the air as the hand gripped my ankle and pulled me down. The last thing I saw was the sky above, twisting and writhing like it was alive before the world swallowed me whole. The crossing continued. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light. It was a presence, tangible and suffocating. It wrapped around me like a second skin, pulling me deeper into whatever void I had stumbled into. My screams echoed back at me, distorted and wrong, as if the darkness was mocking my fear. When I landed, the impact jolted through my entire body, knocking the breath from my lungs. The ground beneath me was cold and uneven, like wet stone slick, with something I didn't want to identify. I struggled to sit up, my fingers scrabbling for purchase, but the air was thick and cloying, pressing down on me like a weight. It was silent here, a silence so profound it roared in my ears. Even my breathing sounded muted, swallowed by the oppressive stillness. My eyes strained against the darkness, but there was nothing to see. No walls, no horizon, no end. I wasn't alone. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, the heavy, oppressive weight of something watching me. My skin prickled, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. It wasn't just one presence, it was many, countless eyes hidden in the black, their gaze burning into me with an intensity that made my stomach churn. The ground shifted beneath me, and I froze. Something was moving, slithering just out of sight, its movement slow and deliberate. The sound was faint but unmistakable, the soft scrape of something wet dragging across the stone. A low hum began to vibrate through the air, so deep I felt it more than heard it. It grew louder, resonating in my chest, until it became a voice, deep and guttural, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The darkness parted just slightly, and I saw it. A figure emerged, its shape barely discernible against the black. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its limbs were too long, its proportions twisted and wrong, as if it had been stretched and reshaped into something grotesque. Its head tilted unnaturally, and though it had no eyes, I knew it was looking directly at me. The voice grew louder, clearer, and I realized it wasn't speaking to me. It was inside me, the words scraping against the walls of my mind like claws. "You should not have come here." I tried to speak, to defend myself, but the words stuck in my throat. The figure took a step closer, and the ground trembled beneath its weight. Its presence was overwhelming, filling the space with an energy that made my teeth ache and my bones feel brittle. "You opened the door," it said, the words reverberating through me, "and now it cannot be closed." The whispers started again, faint and distant at first, but growing louder with each passing second. They came from every direction, overlapping and chaotic, each voice a chorus of pain and despair. The figure raised a hand, its fingers long and gnarled, and pointed at me. The whispers stopped, and for a moment the silence was deafening. Then the screaming began. It wasn't coming from me. It was coming from the darkness itself. It was a symphony of agony, voices of men, women, and children, all crying out at once, their pain and fear palpable. The darkness writhed, shifting and twisting like a living thing, and I realized the shapes moving within it weren't just shadows. They were faces. They were faces. Hundreds of them, their features distorted and contorted in torment, their mouths open in silent screams. They swirled around me, their hollow eyes locked onto mine, their expressions pleading and accusing. All at once, the figure stepped closer, and the faces scattered, retreating into the void. It loomed over me, its form towering and oppressive, and I felt my strength draining away, my body growing heavy and weak. "You will stay," it said, its voice final and unyielding. "You belong to us now." Now, the ground beneath me cracked, and I felt myself sinking, the cold stone giving way to something warm and viscous. I struggled, clawing at the edges, but the more I fought, the deeper I sank. The figure watched, unmoving, as I was consumed, the darkness swallowing me whole. My screams were lost in the void, drowned out by the whispers and the laughter that had returned, sharper and more sinister than before. I was falling again, deeper this time, the air growing colder and thinner with each passing second. The faces followed, their hollow eyes burning into me, their mouths moving silently as if trying to tell me something I couldn't understand. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I was back in the square, the fountain before me, its surface rippling, as if disturbed by an unseen force. The air was still, the silence absolute, and the world felt wrong, tilted and off-kilter. The book was lying at my feet again, its pages open to a new word, run, like Dick and P. But there was nowhere to go. The square was empty, the streets dark and endless, and the whispers were still there, faint but growing louder. The figure's voice echoed in my mind, a final warning that sent chills down my spine. You cannot escape. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, the book clutched tightly in my hands, the laughter chasing me into the darkness. But the crossing continued. The sound of my footsteps on the cracked pavement was the only thing tethering me to reality. Every corner I turned felt like a mistake, leading me deeper into a labyrinth of silent streets. The shadows stretched impossibly long, creeping toward me as though they were alive, hungry. The whispers were everywhere now, no longer faint, but not yet clear. They slithered around my mind, just out of reach, taunting me. I tried not to think about the fountain or the faces in the darkness, but the image was seared into my brain. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them staring back at me. I tightened my grip on the book, its leather cover slick with sweat from my trembling hands. I hadn't dared to open it again since seeing that single word, run. But even with it closed, I felt its weight. Not physical, but something heavier, suffocating. The air grew colder as I moved, my breath visible in short, frantic puffs. The streetlights flickered weakly, as though struggling to hold back the encroaching blackness. And then, without warning, they went out completely, plunging me into total darkness. Panic clawed at my chest. I froze, every muscle in my body screaming at me to move. But I couldn't. The whispers surged, louder now, and I swore I could feel them brushing against my skin like cold, damp fingers. Something shifted behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing there. The silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. But I knew I wasn't alone. The air was heavy with the sensation of being watched, and it wasn't the benign curiosity of a passerby. This was something predatory, calculating. The book pulsed in my hands, a faint, rhythmic thrum that matched the erratic beat of my heart. Against every instinct, screaming at me to keep it closed, I pried it open. The pages were blank again, but not for long. Slowly, as though written by an invisible hand, letters began to appear. Do not turn around. The breath caught in my throat. My fingers gripped the book so tightly that the leather creaked. I didn't want to believe it, but I felt it. The presence behind me, closer now. The hairs on the back of my neck rose, and my body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The whispers shifted, overlapping into something resembling words, but they were wrong, fractured and incomprehensible. Whatever was behind me wasn't human. Another message scrawled itself onto the page, the letters sharp and urgent. It sees you. that I will you. It sees you. A cold wave of dread washed over me, and our knees nearly buckled. Slowly, I forced myself to take a step forward, then another. My breaths were shallow, my every movement deliberate. I couldn't risk turning around. The ground beneath my feet felt different, softer, as though I were walking on something alive. I didn't dare look down. My focus remained fixed on the faint outline of a building ahead, its windows glowing dimly. A beacon. Safety. The whispers grew louder, angrier, as if protesting my attempt to leave. My legs burned with effort, each step feeling like wading through quicksand. I reached the building's door, my hand trembling as I grasped the rusted handle. It didn't budge. Behind me, the presence shifted again, and this time I felt its breath on the back of my neck, cold and foul, reeking of decay. I slammed my fists against the door, desperation overriding any semblance of control. The book slipped from my grasp and hit the ground with a dull thud. The pages flew open, and a single phrase burned itself onto the paper. Turn around. No. Bois. Voilà. Lutus. Peace. I clenched my eyes shut, refusing to obey. But the whispers became deafening, a cacophony of voices all screaming the same command. Turn around. I didn't want to. I couldn't. But my body betrayed me, slowly, as though pulled by an unseen force. I turned. The thing that stood before me wasn't human. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its face featureless, save for a mouth that stretched far too wide. The darkness clung to it like a shroud, its edges flickering like shadows in a firelight. Its mouth moved, and though it made no sound, the whispers exploded in my mind, clear for the first time. You belong to us. Aluflus Anishai. The world shifted, the ground tilting beneath me, as though reality itself were unraveling. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the creature's mouth stretching even wider, its edges splitting open like cracks in a porcelain mask. Then came the silence. When I woke, I was back at the fountain. The water was still, the air unnaturally calm. The book lay open on my lap, its pages blank once more. But I wasn't alone. The faces were there, watching me from the darkness, their expressions frozen in eternal torment, and I knew, without a doubt, that I would never leave. The air felt thicker as I stood there, my mind clawing for clarity, for some explanation that might make sense of the chaos. The faces hadn't moved, but they didn't need to. Their silent presence pressed on me like an unspoken accusation, and I could feel my sanity unraveling thread by thread. I clutched the book tighter, its leather cover slick against my trembling hands. Its pages were still blank, a taunting void that offered no answers, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. Not an inanimate object, but something alive, sentient, waiting. The water in the fountain rippled suddenly, as though disturbed by an invisible hand. I staggered back, my pulse roaring in my ears. Something rose from the water. No, not something. Someone. It was a woman, her figure faint and translucent, as though carved from mist. Her eyes locked onto mine, and the sorrow in them was so profound, so consuming, that I almost forgot to breathe. She raised a hand, her movements deliberate, beckoning me closer. "No," I whispered, though my voice sounded small and alien. I tried to step back, but my legs wouldn't obey. Instead, I was moving toward her, drawn by some invisible force I couldn't fight. The air around her grew colder with every step I took. My breath fogged in front of me, and my skin prickled with goosebumps. When I reached the edge of the fountain, she reached out, her hand hovering inches from mine. "Don't," I managed to choke out, but it was too late. Her fingers brushed against mine, and the world tilted violently. The fountain was gone. The faces were gone. I was standing in a house, its walls warped and bleeding with shadows that seemed alive. The floor creaked beneath my feet, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew and something metallic. Blood. Blood. I turned slowly, taking in the scene. The house was in ruins, its furniture overturned, its walls smeared with dark, oily stain. And then I saw her again, standing at the end of a long hallway, her form more solid now, more real. She looked over her shoulder, her expression unreadable, before disappearing into the darkness. My feet moved before I could stop them. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run. But something stronger kept me moving forward. The hallway stretched endlessly, its shadows growing darker, deeper, until I could barely see a foot in front of me. The whispers returned, faint at first, but growing louder with each step. They didn't surround me this time. They came from within, a cacophony of voices clawing at my mind. I stopped abruptly as the floor beneath me shifted, the wooden planks groaning as though under immense pressure. The hallway opened into a room, its walls covered in mirrors. The woman stood in the center, her back to me. "Who are you?" My voice was barely a whisper, but she turned at the sound, her movements slow, deliberate. Her face was familiar now. Too familiar. It was my face, but not. The eyes were wrong, the expression colder, detached. She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. "You let it in," she said, her voice a haunting echo of my own. The mirrors around us shattered simultaneously, the sound deafening. Shards of glass flew in every direction, yet none of them touched me. The room dissolved, replaced by the street outside the fountain. But it wasn't the same. The town was warped, its buildings twisted and broken, their windows dark and empty. The air buzzed with an electric charge, and the shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Entities Leonori, Lesher, Baukarna. I was back at the fountain, the book lying open on the ground. Its pages were no longer blank. A single word was scrawled across them in bold, jagged letters. Stay. I couldn't move. My legs refused to obey, as though rooted to the spot. The faces in the darkness emerged again, but they weren't in the shadows anymore. They were in the buildings, in the ground, in the very air around me. And then I saw her, the woman, the other me, standing across the fountain. Her expression was calm, serene, but her eyes burned with something darker. You were always meant to be here, she said, though her lips didn't move. Her voice echoed in my mind, clear and undeniable. The book snapped shut on its own, and the world plunged into silence. The silence was oppressive, thick, like a suffocating fog. Eerie, my breath came in shallow gasps, as the woman, my reflection but not, stood unmoving across the fountain. Her eyes bore into me, unblinking, filled with an intensity that felt like it could peel away layers of my being. I tried to speak, to demand answers, but my voice was gone. It was as if the very air around me had been stolen, leaving only a void where sound could not exist. My legs felt like lead, frozen in place, while my mind screamed at me to move, to run. Then she tilted her head, her gaze softening, almost curious. She pointed a finger toward the book, still lying on the ground between us. Envelop somebody. It flipped open on its own, its pages fluttering furiously before settling. The word stay had disappeared, replaced by symbols, strange, jagged markings that seemed to pulse and shift like living things. The symbols burned themselves into my vision. Even when I shut my eyes, they glowed behind my eyelids, growing brighter and brighter until they seemed to be etched into my mind. And then I heard it, a low hum, deep and resonant, building into a roar that vibrated through my chest. The ground beneath me began to tremble. Cracks spider-webbed outward from the fountain, splitting the pavement and revealing something dark and pulsing beneath the surface. The air grew colder, sharper, until it felt like needles prickling my skin. I finally found my voice, though it was little more than a whisper. What do you want from me? Ooh. She didn't answer, but her smile widened, and the roar around us intensified. The cracks widened, and I stumbled back as a black, viscous substance began to seep through. It glistened unnaturally in the dim light, spreading like a living thing, reaching for my feet. I turned to run, but the town was no longer the same. The streets twisted and warped, buildings leaning at impossible angles. Doors and windows blinked open and shut like living eyes. and the whispers were back, louder now, merging into a cacophony of voices that overlapped and bled together. No escape, the voices said in unison. You called us here. I clutched my head, trying to block out the noise, but it was inside me, reverberating through my skull. My knees buckled, and I fell, my palms hitting the cold, cracked pavement. The black substance crept closer, curling around me like smoke. I felt it then, a searing, icy touch against my skin. It wasn't the substance, it was something beneath it. Fingers, clawing, pulling. I scrambled backward, but they followed, the hands emerging from the darkness, pale and skeletal. Let me go, I screamed, my voice finally breaking free. The woman stepped closer, her movements fluid, almost graceful. She knelt beside the fountain, her hand hovering over the book. The symbols on its pages glowed brighter, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move independently of the light. You wrote this, she said, her voice calm and unwavering. Every choice, every action, every word, you built it. I didn't. You did, she interrupted, her tone sharp now. You invited it in, and now it will not leave. The cracks beneath me widened, and I could see more of the black void beneath. The hands clawed their way higher, gripping my arms, my legs. My body felt heavy, as though the earth itself was trying to drag me down. Fight it, I muttered to myself. This isn't real. It can't be real. Her laughter cut through the chaos, soft but piercing. Reality bends to belief, and you've believed in this more than anything. The ground gave way entirely, and I fell. The world above dissolved into a blur of light and sound as I plunged into the darkness below. It wasn't cold, like I expected. It wasn't anything, just an endless, weightless void. But I wasn't alone. I could feel them, countless eyes watching, countless hands reaching. The whispers returned, softer now, but no less invasive. They spoke my name, over and over, dragging it through their fragmented, dissonant voices. And then I hit the ground. I was back in the town square, the fountain whole again, the cracks and black substance gone. The book lay closed beside me, its leather cover pristine. The air was still, almost serene, but the weight in my chest hadn't lifted. When I looked up, she was gone, but her presence lingered, an unseen shadow that clung to the edges of my vision. The streets were empty, the buildings silent, but I knew they were watching. And waiting. What? The quiet was deceptive. I knew better now. Emily, only Triddle, Tranquil, shivers. Silence didn't mean peace. It meant anticipation. A moment stolen to let fear metastasize. I stumbled to my feet, muscles trembling, every part of me aching. The town square was unchanged, perfectly, hauntingly normal. That's what made it worse. Emftul. Mort. The book lay at my feet, its leather cover mocking me. My instinct was to leave it, but it wasn't that simple. The thing wasn't just a book anymore. It was the epicenter of whatever horror I had unleashed. The memory of the symbols burning into my vision made me hesitate, but something else, a pull, faint but insistent, urged me to pick it up. I crouched, fingers brushing the worn leather. Then, as soon as I touched it, a jolt shot through my hand, a crackle of energy that made my breath hitch. I yanked my hand back, but it was too late. The book flipped open, pages turning on their own, and the symbols returned, glowing faintly, pulsing like they were alive. Words began to form on the page, stark and definitive. Elior, you cannot run. The pull intensified this time from inside me. I clutched my chest, gasping as a searing pain tore through me, like something was clawing its way out. My vision blurred, the world spinning, but I couldn't look away from the words. They shifted, rearranged themselves. You wrote this ending. I fell backward, my body hitting the cold ground with a thud. The sensation wasn't just physical anymore. The words burrowed deeper into my mind, weaving themselves into my thoughts. They were becoming mine. Emul, Galut Sul, I send, sird. No, I whispered, choking on the word. This isn't my story. I didn't, but I had, hadn't I? Pieces of memory, fragmented and out of focus, clawed their way to the surface. Late nights, scribbled pages, frantic typing. The story I thought I'd been creating wasn't creation at all. No. It was a transcription. Something had been feeding me the details, seeding my mind with images and events. I was never the author. I was just the scribe. The realization hit me like a tidal wave. I stumbled to my feet, clutching the book. The air grew heavier, denser, as though the world itself was pressing in on me. The ground began to ripple, the pavement twisting like liquid. I tried to move, but the force of the pull kept me rooted. And then they came. From every direction, the shadows began to coalesce. First as faint smudges against the buildings, then as solid forms, distorted figures with elongated limbs and featureless faces. They moved with a jerking, unnatural rhythm, closing in with every heartbeat. Their presence was suffocating, a weight that pressed down on my chest until I thought my ribs would shatter. One stepped closer, its form flickering as though it couldn't fully manifest. When it moved, I felt it. An echo in my bones, a deep, resonating hum that matched the pull from the book. The connection was undeniable. Emva, Pitu, Sutane. Connection was undeniable. The shadows encircled me, and I understood. They weren't here to destroy me. They were waiting, watching. Take it back, I whispered. Please, take it back. The shadows didn't respond, but the pull inside me grew stronger, sharper, until I could no longer resist. My hands moved on their own, gripping the book tighter. Its pages fanned out, symbols glowing brighter and brighter, until the light burned my eyes. The pull became a roar, and I realized it wasn't just in me. It was in everything. The town, the air, the earth itself, all vibrating with the same terrible energy. The words on the page shifted one last time, forming a single command: finish it. Tears streamed down my face as I began to write, not with a pen or even my fingers. The words poured from me, pulled from the depths of my soul. My thoughts weren't my own anymore. They belonged to the book, to the shadows, to whatever malevolent force had been orchestrating this all along. The more I wrote, the darker the world around me became. The buildings crumbled into ash, the sky dissolved into an endless void, and the shadows drew closer, their forms flickering faster. I wrote of the end, my end, the town's end. Every stroke of my invisible pen brought us closer to annihilation. And yet, even as the darkness consumed everything, I felt a terrible clarity. This was always how it was meant to be. When the last word was written, the pull stopped. The book slammed shut, and the shadows froze for one brief, harrowing moment. There was silence again. Then the world exploded, not with fire or sound, but with absence. Everything, the town, the shadows, the book, imploded into a singular point of darkness, dragging me with it. The sensation was beyond pain, beyond fear. It was nothingness, complete and unrelenting. And then it was over. I opened my eyes to find myself standing in the town square once more. The fountain was whole, the streets silent, the air still. The book was gone, and so were the shadows. But I wasn't alone. I felt them, their presence lingering just out of sight, just beyond perception, watching, waiting. And in my hand, though I didn't remember picking it up, was a pen. I should have turned back when I saw the cabin. Ambiance, it stood there, half hidden among the towering pines, like a wound in the earth. The clearing around it was too still, too quiet. No birds, no wind, just the oppressive weight of silence that pressed against my chest like a hand squeezing my lungs. The air had a sharp metallic tang, like old blood, and the ground felt damp even though it hadn't rained in days. The cabin itself looked ancient, its walls warped and sagging under the weight of years. Moss clung to the wood in patches, and dark symbols were carved into every visible surface. Spirals, jagged lines, shapes that seemed to shift if you looked at them too long. I remember stepping closer, despite myself, drawn in by a force I couldn't name. The door was slightly ajar, swaying just enough to reveal the black void inside. I should have left right then, but curiosity, or maybe arrogance, pushed me forward. The first step onto the porch made the wood groan loud enough to echo through the trees, but it was too late to stop. Crossing the threshold felt like stepping into another world. The air was thick and cold, carrying a smell that turned my stomach. Decay, wet earth, and something sharp that stung the back of my throat. The light outside didn't seem to penetrate the interior. The shadows stretched and writhed as though they were alive. My flashlight flickered, its weak beam catching glints of objects scattered across the room. The walls were covered in those same strange carvings, the grooves deeper and more chaotic than they had appeared from the outside. A table stood in the center, its surface cracked and stained, with a rusted knife driven straight into the wood. Surrounding it were crude little dolls made of sticks and twine, their heads adorned with tufts of hair that I prayed weren't human. And then there was the journal. It was lying on the floor near the table, its cover warped and blackened at the edges. I picked it up, my fingers trembling as I flipped through the pages. The handwriting inside was frantic, the ink smeared and faded. The words didn't make sense at first. Jumbled sentences about the forest being alive, about whispers in the dark, about things that weren't human watching from the trees. Then I read the last entry. If you're reading this, you've already lost. It knows you're here. It's inside you now. My pulse thundered in my ears as I slammed the journal shut. But the sound wasn't just in my head. A low hum began to fill the room, vibrating through the walls and floor. I spun around, the flashlight beam dancing wildly, and that's when I saw it. The far corner of the room was darker than the rest, a void so complete that it seemed to swallow the light. And from that void, something moved. It was slow at first, just the faintest ripple, but then it surged forward, a shadow that stretched and grew until it stood taller than the ceiling. Its shape was wrong, its limbs too long, its movements too fluid. I backed away, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps, but the thing didn't follow. It just stood there, watching, though it had no eyes. The carvings on the walls began to glow faintly, their light pulsing in time with the hum that now felt like it was coming from inside my skull. The door slammed shut behind me, and the cabin seemed to breathe, the walls bowing inward, as if the entire structure were alive. My legs finally obeyed, and I ran, crashing through the door and stumbling into the clearing. But the forest wasn't the same. The trees had shifted, their trunks leaning inward, their branches weaving into a canopy so dense that no light could filter through. The path I had come from was gone, replaced by an endless maze of shadowed trails. And then I heard it, the whisper, low, guttural, impossible to trace. Whoa! It wasn't one voice, but many, overlapping and discordant. They weren't speaking English. They weren't speaking any language I knew, but I understood. You don't leave. Panic surged through me, and I ran blindly, branches tearing at my face and arms. The whispers grew louder, filling the air, filling my head. My foot caught on a root, and I hit the ground hard. The wind knocked out of me. When I looked up, the cabin was there again. The door wide open as though inviting me back inside. The glow of the carvings flickered like dying embers, and I realized, with a sinking dread, that they weren't glowing, they were burning. Smoke curled up from the walls, but the fire didn't spread. It just stayed there, smoldering, alive. I don't know how long I sat there, staring. Minutes, hours, time had no meaning anymore. All I knew was that the forest was watching. It wasn't just the cabin. The entire place was alive. And it wasn't going to let me go. When I finally stood, the whispers faded, replaced by a silence even more oppressive. The path was gone, and the forest stretched endlessly in every direction. But the cabin, it was always there, no matter where I turned. It was waiting. The cabin stayed in my line of sight, no matter where I turned, like some malignant star pulling me into its orbit. I thought I could outpace it, run far enough, fast enough, and escape. But the forest had other plans. Every path I took looped back to the same spot. The air grew heavier, the scent of burning wood and damp earth suffocating me with every breath. I tried to convince myself it was just fear, that the whispers were nothing more than the wind playing tricks on me. But I knew better. There was something intelligent here, something deliberate. It wasn't just a predator, it was worse. And it was patient. The ground beneath me shifted as I walked, the soil soft and yielding like the cabin had somehow infected the land itself. My boots sank deeper with every step, and soon I was knee-deep in muck, fighting to pull free. The trees around me leaned closer, their twisted branches scraping the sky in jagged patterns. And then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong, a wet, slithering noise, like something dragging itself through the mire. My pulse spiked, and I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was just behind me. I turned slowly, afraid of what I might see. At first, there was nothing, just the oppressive darkness and the faint glow of the symbols etched into the trees. But then I saw it, emerging from the shadows like it had always been there. It was long and serpentine, its body coiling and uncoiling as it moved. Its surface glistened like oil slicked over muscle, and where its face should have been, there was only a mass of writhing tendrils, each tipped with an eye. They blinked in unison, their collective gaze locking onto me. With a predatory hunger, I stumbled backward, my feet slipping in the mud. The creature moved with an unnatural grace, its body undulating as it advanced. I reached for the nearest branch, desperate for something to defend myself with, but it was slick and brittle, snapping uselessly in my hands. The creature stopped a few feet away, its tendrils twitching as if tasting the air, and then it spoke, not in words, but in that same guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You are marked." The words carved through me, a psychic wound that left me gasping for air. My vision blurred, the forest tilting and spinning as the creature loomed closer. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable, but nothing happened. When I opened them, the creature was gone. The forest was still again, but the sense of being watched hadn't left. If anything, it was stronger now, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. I staggered forward, half blind and desperate to escape, but the path had disappeared. The trees were shifting around me, their roots writhing like serpents to block my way. I could feel the forest closing in, herding me back to the cabin. The whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping until they became a cacophony of voices that burrowed into my mind. They weren't just speaking, they were commanding. Return, surrender. Belong, belong. I fought against it, digging my fingers into the bark of a nearby tree to anchor myself. The carvings on the trunk flared to life, their glow searing my skin like fire. I pulled away with a scream, clutching my hand as blisters formed where the light had touched me. But the pain was grounding. It cut through the fog in my mind, giving me just enough clarity to push forward. I ran, ignoring the branches that tore at my clothes and the roots that tried to trip me. The cabin was gone from view, but I could feel its pull, a magnetic force dragging me back even as I tried to resist. I don't know how far I ran, or how long. Time had become meaningless, the sun never rising, the moon never setting. But eventually, I stumbled into a clearing. At first, I thought I'd escaped. The air was lighter here. The oppressive weight of the forest momentarily lifted. But as I stepped further into the clearing, I realized it wasn't freedom. It was a trap. Then, the ground beneath me began to shift, the soil rippling like water. Symbols etched themselves into the earth, glowing with that same sickly light. The whispers rose to a fever pitch, and then the ground split open, revealing a gaping chasm that pulsed like a heartbeat. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The forest had herded me here for a reason. And now I understood why. I wasn't just trapped. I was chosen. And the cabin, it was waiting for me. At the edge of the clearing, its door wide open. The moment I stepped toward the cabin, the air thickened as though I were walking into water. My breath caught in my throat, each step pulling me closer to something I couldn't fully see, but felt with every nerve in my body. The whispers were quieter now, but more intimate, like they were curling directly into my mind. Inside the cabin, The flickering light from unseen candles painted shifting patterns on the walls. The room seemed larger than it should have been, stretching into corners that didn't belong, their shadows writhing like living things. I hesitated on the threshold, my instincts screaming at me to turn back. But my body betrayed me. My legs moved on their own, carrying me over the threshold and into the suffocating interior. The door slammed shut behind me with a force that shook the walls. I spun around, grasping at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged, and I pounded on the wood, shouting for help. But my voice came back to me, warped and distorted, swallowed by the unnatural acoustics of the cabin. Then I saw it. A figure standing in the far corner, shrouded in shadow. Its outline flickered like a bad signal, indistinct and shifting. My pulse thundered as I pressed myself against the door, my hand fumbling for anything to defend myself with. But the cabin was barren, save for a single wooden table in the center of the room. The figure didn't move, but the longer I looked, the more details emerged. It was impossibly tall, its head brushing the ceiling beams. Its limbs were too long, its joints bending at unnatural angles. The shadows clinging to it seemed alive, shifting and twisting as though trying to escape its presence. I forced myself to look away, my gaze landing on the table. A book lay open on its surface, its pages filled with symbols that glowed faintly, as if written in liquid fire. The writing was incomprehensible, yet I felt its meaning pressing into my mind, unbidden and unwelcome. Read, go. Chew. The command wasn't spoken. It bypassed my ears entirely and embedded itself directly into my thoughts. My feet moved without my permission, carrying me to the table. My hands trembled as I reached for the book, my fingers hovering just above the pages. Oh, read, going. The demand was louder now, more insistent. My fingers brushed the paper, and a jolt shot through me like an electric current coursing through my veins. The symbols writhed on the page, reshaping themselves into words I could suddenly understand, though I wished I couldn't. They spoke of the forest, of the cabin, of a hunger that couldn't be sated. The words painted a picture of an ancient force, older than time itself, that demanded offerings to sustain its existence. The sacrifices weren't physical. They were something deeper, more personal. Your fear, your pain, your mind. I jerked my hand back, the connection breaking. The room spun, and I stumbled, my vision swimming with afterimages of the symbols. The figure in the corner was closer now, though I hadn't seen it move. You cannot leave. The thought wasn't mine, but it felt as though it had been planted there, rooting itself in my consciousness. My legs buckled, and I dropped to my knees, clutching my head as the whispers turned into a deafening roar. The cabin seemed to warp around me, its walls bending and shifting like a living thing. The shadows from the figure stretched toward me, curling around my limbs like chains. I struggled, but it was like fighting against a tide, the force pulling me deeper into the cabin's grip. The book's pages began to turn on their own, faster and faster, the glow intensifying until it was blinding. The words leapt from the page, spiraling around me in a torrent of light and sound. They weren't just words anymore. They were alive, burrowing into my skin, my mind, my soul. And then, everything went still. The light vanished, the shadows receded, and the whispers faded into silence. The figure was gone, but I wasn't alone. The cabin itself seemed to breathe, its walls pulsing faintly, as though it had consumed something and was now sated. But I knew better. It wasn't done with me. This was just the beginning. The cabin seemed alive now. The walls pulsed faintly, their surface shifting as though they were breathing. I tried to move, to push myself away from the table, but my body felt as if it were glued to the spot. My limbs were leaden, my muscles twitching under a force. I couldn't fight. The air grew heavier, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. The book was open again, though I had no memory of touching it. The pages glowed faintly, and the symbols writhed like insects trapped under glass. They seemed to taunt me, daring me to look closer. Against my better judgment, I leaned in, my eyes drawn to the ever-shifting text. Suddenly, the cabin shifted again, the walls stretching impossibly outward, creating a vast expanse of darkness. The table beneath my hands disappeared, replaced by cold, damp earth. I was no longer in the cabin. I was somewhere else entirely, a forest shrouded in perpetual night. The trees loomed above me, their branches intertwining to form a canopy so dense not even starlight could penetrate. I turned, hoping to find some point of reference, some way out, but the forest seemed endless, every direction identical to the last. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, as though the ground beneath me wasn't solid, but hollow. The sound grew louder with each step until it became deafening, like the forest itself was mocking my attempt to escape. Then I heard it, a low, guttural sound that sent ice through my veins. It wasn't a growl or a roar, but something deeper, more primal, like the earth itself was groaning in pain. My heart raced as I spun around, searching for the source, but the forest remained empty, eerily still. The sound grew closer, vibrating through the ground and up into my legs. Hull. Muristun. The trees began to shift, their branches twisting and writhing as though trying to reach for me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled backward, tripping over a root and landing hard on the ground. Above me, the trees parted, revealing not the sky, but a gaping void. It wasn't empty. It pulsated with an otherworldly light, faint and sickly green, as though the void itself was alive. The groaning grew louder, more insistent, until it felt as though it would split my skull. Then I saw it. A figure emerging from the void. It was massive, its form indistinct and shifting, as though it were made of smoke and shadow. It had no face, yet I could feel its gaze piercing through me, weighing my very existence. Offer. Ens. Dei. Deul de mordi. Einteil. Offer. The command slammed into my mind like a hammer, forcing me to clutch my head in agony, my vision blurred. The world spinning as the voice echoed again, louder this time. Offer. Down. I didn't know what it wanted. My thoughts were fragmented, my memories slipping away like water through my fingers. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees whispering words I couldn't understand but felt deep in my core. Offer. Enus. Hevien. Telmodil dole. Oh, I couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't think. The figure reached toward me, its limbs stretching impossibly long. Tendrils of shadow coiling around my body. They weren't solid, but their touch burned, searing through my skin and into my soul. As the pain intensified, images began to flash in my mind. Memories, fragments of my life, distorted and twisted. The cabin, the book, the symbols. The envelop, they were all connected, pieces of a puzzle I couldn't comprehend. And then I understood. The offer wasn't something physical. It wanted more. Me. It wanted me. The tendrils tightened their grip, pulling me closer to the figure. My vision darkened. The forest fading into nothingness as the void consumed me. The last thing I saw was the faint glow of the book, its symbols still writhing, as though mocking me for ever believing I could escape. I wasn't gone. Evil. I wasn't gone. Not yet. But I wasn't whole either. Something had been taken, something I couldn't name, but I felt its absence like a gaping wound. The void didn't just consume. It replaced, filling the emptiness with something dark and ancient. And I knew, without a doubt, that this was far from over. The void wasn't empty. As I stood there, or floated, or simply existed, I realized I wasn't alone. Shadows moved with deliberate intent, slipping through the dark, like predators circling prey. They had no discernible form, but their presence was suffocating, filling the emptiness with a crushing weight. The groaning sound returned, deeper now, resonating in my chest like a second heartbeat. It was as if the void itself were alive, its every pulse drawing me further into its grasp. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, not by one entity, but by countless unseen eyes. One shadow separated from the rest, coalescing into something tangible. Its edges were jagged, constantly shifting as though it was fighting to maintain its shape. It loomed before me, taller than any human, its mass dense and oppressive. Why? Oh. The question wasn't spoken aloud, but slammed into my thoughts like a battering ram. It wasn't just a word. It was an accusation, a demand. My chest tightened as the word echoed through my mind, twisting my thoughts into knots. I didn't know how to answer. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. The figure tilted its head, or what I assumed was its head, waiting for a response. My silence seemed to anger it. The shadows around me thickened, pressing closer, their cold tendrils brushing against my skin. You called. The accusation was clearer now, sharper, and laced with something that felt like contempt. I tried to shake my head, to deny it, but the memory of the book flashed in my mind. The symbols, the whispers, the ritual. I hadn't realized I was performing. You offered. Wow. Well, you offered. The figures' words cut through me, each one a blade of guilt. I hadn't offered anything, had I? The thought spiraled, unraveling as I remembered the blood, the candlelight, the way the cabin had shifted. But that wasn't intentional. Wow. It couldn't have been. The shadows surged forward, engulfing me in their freezing embrace. My body went numb, the sensation of weightlessness giving way to a crushing force that pinned me in place. The figure's form expanded, its jagged edges blurring as it enveloped me completely. And then it showed me. Images burst into my mind, vivid and violent. A child's laughter echoing through a forest, abruptly silenced by a scream. A man standing at the edge of a cliff, his face a mask of despair, as he took a final step into the void. A woman staring into a mirror, her reflection twisted and wrong, reaching out to her with clawed hands. Each vision was accompanied by the same question. Why? I wanted to scream, to beg for it to stop, but my voice was gone, stolen by the void. The figure's presence was overwhelming now, filling every corner of my mind, leaving no room for my own thoughts. The price. Those words shattered everything. The weight of them crushed me, leaving me gasping for air I couldn't find. The price. Ambiance. What price? I hadn't agreed to anything, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The book, the ritual. I'd set something in motion, something I couldn't undo. The price is paid. The shadows receded, leaving me alone in the void once more. My body ached as though I'd been wrung out and discarded. The oppressive presence was gone, but its mark lingered, etched into my very being. I looked down at my hands, expecting to see blood or some physical sign of what had been taken from me. But there was nothing, and yet I felt hollow, as though a piece of me had been carved away and replaced with something dark and foreign. The void began to shift again, the shadows retreating into the distance. I felt the ground solidify beneath me, the cold dampness replaced by the rough texture of wood. I was back in the cabin. The book lay on the table, closed now, its surface unmarred. The symbols were gone, leaving behind only a blank cover, but I could still feel its power. A silent pulse that matched the beat of my own heart. And then I noticed the mirror. That it was small, hanging crookedly on the far wall. I hadn't seen it before, but it was there now, reflecting the room in distorted fragments. I stepped toward it, my movements slow and uncertain, as though I were wading through water. When I reached the mirror, I almost didn't recognize the face staring back at me. It was me, but it wasn't. My eyes were darker, sunken, with a faint glow that wasn't natural. My reflection smiled, but I hadn't moved. And then it spoke. "You are the price." The cabin dissolved around me, the mirror shattering into countless shards that floated in the air like stars. The void returned, swallowing me whole. The air was suffocating, heavy with the weight of something unseen but undeniably present. I tried to focus on my breathing, to anchor myself in the rhythm of inhale and exhale. But the rhythm was wrong. It wasn't just my breath I was hearing. It was something deeper, slower, vibrating through the room like a second heartbeat. The cabin groaned, the wood creaking as though it were alive, shifting under the strain of an invisible force. My eyes darted around, trying to find the source of the sound. But the shadows had grown thicker, pooling in the corners like ink spreading through water. I was drawn to the mirror again, its fractured surface shimmering with a faint, unnatural light. The reflection was no longer mine. How? It was something else entirely. The face staring back at me was distorted, its features stretched and twisted as though someone had tried to reshape it with their bare hands. Its eyes were hollow voids, pulling me in, threatening to drown me in their darkness. It moved, not a flicker or a shimmer, but a deliberate motion. The thing in the mirror tilted its head, its mouth curling into a grin that was too wide, too full of teeth. "Let me out." The voice wasn't external. "You." It clawed its way through my thoughts, bypassing my ears entirely. It was raw and guttural, a sound that didn't belong in this world. My knees buckled, and I reached out to steady myself on the table, my hand brushing against the cold surface of the book. The book. Bims and Surufani Suru. Bint. It was open now, its pages blank except for a single line scrawled in jagged, uneven handwriting. "The price has been accepted." I tried to tear my gaze away, but the words burned into my mind, carving themselves into the fabric of my thoughts. My vision blurred, the room spinning as the shadows began to move. They weren't just static forms anymore. These too, anymore. They were alive, writhing and crawling like living creatures, circling me with predatory intent. I stumbled back, my heel catching on the edge of the rug, sending me sprawling to the floor. The impact knocked the breath out of me, but I barely registered the pain. The shadows had grown arms, long, skeletal limbs that reached toward me, their touch cold and searing all at once. I scrambled to my feet, my hands searching for anything to defend myself. My fingers closed around a shard of glass from the shattered lantern, and I swung wildly, the jagged edge slicing through the air. The shadows recoiled, but only for a moment. You cannot fight us. And the voice came again, louder this time, reverberating through the cabin like a thunderclap. The shadows surged forward, their forms twisting into grotesque shapes. Faces that weren't faces, mouths filled with jagged teeth, eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. I felt them press against me, their weight rushing and suffocating, driving me to my knees. My grip on the glass shard faltered, and it slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor. "Let me out." The words echoed again, and I realized they weren't coming from the mirror anymore. They were inside me, reverberating through my chest, consuming every thought and sensation. My hands moved without my consent, reaching for the book, flipping its pages with frantic urgency. The symbols returned, glowing faintly, their lines shifting and pulsing as though they were alive. My fingers traced them, compelled by an unseen force, the heat from the ink burning into my skin. I tried to pull away, but it was too late. The cabin shuddered violently, the walls bowing inward, as though the entire structure were being crushed. The shadows poured into the book, their forms dissolving into the pages, like smoke drawn into a vacuum. For a moment, there was silence, and then the book exploded with light, a blinding flash that burned through my vision, leaving me reeling. When my sight returned, the cabin was still. The shadows were gone, the air no longer oppressive, but I wasn't alone. Standing before me, its form shimmering like a heat mirage, was the figure from the mirror. It was no longer bound by the glass, its presence filling the room with an otherworldly energy. Its eyes locked onto mine, and I felt the weight of its gaze, as though it could see every thought, every memory, every fear I had ever had. "You have freed me." The voice was no longer guttural or raw. Any It was smooth, almost melodic, but no less terrifying. The figure stepped closer, its movements fluid and deliberate. "Now, you will fulfill your purpose." I tried to back away, but my body wouldn't respond. My feet were rooted to the floor, my limbs heavy and unyielding. The figure reached out, its hand passing through my chest, not with force, but with an invasive intimacy that made my skin crawl. The sensation was indescribable. A cold fire that burned through my veins, unraveling me from the inside out. My vision darkened at the edges, and I felt myself slipping. My consciousness pulled towards something vast and incomprehensible. "You are mine now." Engel in the beefs. The words were the last thing I heard before everything went black. The darkness swallowed me whole, its weight a suffocating shroud that pressed against my chest, making every breath feel like a battle. My mind raced, clawing for purchase in the void, but there was nothing to hold on to. It was endless, featureless, a chasm that seemed to stretch far beyond comprehension. Yet, I could feel something watching me, its gaze piercing through the blackness, a predator savoring the moment before it pounced. The voice returned, no longer external, but embedded deep within my skull. It resonated with a sickening harmony, like a choir of distorted echoes, all whispering the same unholy refrain, "You are the vessel." I tried to scream, to force the words out of my throat, but I had no mouth, no form. My existence had been reduced to a consciousness, adrift in an ocean of despair. The sensation was alien, disorienting, like being simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. Then the darkness shifted. It wasn't just a void, it was alive. The shadows moved with purpose, coiling around me like tendrils, pulling me deeper. Panic surged through me as I realized they were drawing me towards something. A shape began to emerge, an outline forming in the distance. Ambiance. It was massive, its dimensions impossible to fully grasp, but its presence was suffocating. It radiated power, an ancient, malevolent force that defied understanding. As I approached, the details became clearer. It wasn't a structure or a creature. It was both. The entity was a labyrinth of writhing limbs, shifting faces, and jagged spires, each piece moving independently, yet in perfect harmony. Eyes blinked open across its surface, glowing with an otherworldly light that burned into my soul. You sought answers. Now you will receive them. The words weren't spoken. They were etched directly into my consciousness, each syllable searing like molten metal. Images flooded my mind, too many and too fast to process. Visions of forgotten rituals, blood-soaked altars, and incomprehensible symbols flashed before me. Each one carried with it a fragment of knowledge. Fragments that tore at the seams of my sanity. The entity extended a limb, its surface rippling like liquid as it reached for me. I braced for the pain, but what I felt was worse, an overwhelming sense of belonging. It wasn't claiming me, it was reuniting with me. I was a piece of it, a fragment that had been separated and was now being drawn back into the whole. Memories that weren't mine surged through me. I saw myself standing on ancient cliffs, chanting incantations in a language that predated time. I felt the weight of centuries, the burden of secrets too dangerous to be spoken. And then I understood. I hadn't stumbled upon the book by chance. I hadn't been lured into this nightmare. I had orchestrated it. This was my doing. The book was my creation, a tool designed to bring me back to the entity I had once served. I had been its harbinger, its herald, and I had betrayed it. You thought you could escape. The entity's voice was laced with mockery, its words cutting deeper than any blade. I felt its anger, its betrayal, but beneath it all was an unshakable certainty. It had found me, and it would never let me go again. Pain was serious now. Bellwood school. The darkness began to contract, folding in on itself, pulling me closer to the entity's core. The pressure was unbearable, crushing me from every angle, but I couldn't resist. There was no escape. My form dissolved further, my thoughts unraveling like threads plucked from a tapestry. I was becoming a part of it again, my identity swallowed by the infinite. And then I saw it, the heart of the entity. It was a void within the void, a singularity of pure malevolence that pulsed with an energy that defied existence. As I was drawn closer, I realized what it was. It wasn't a source of power. It was a prison. The entity wasn't free. It was trapped, bound by forces even it couldn't overcome. And it was and now I was to become its key. The last remnants of my consciousness resisted, a feeble attempt to cling to my humanity, but it was too late. The shadows closed in, the tendrils wrapped around my core, and the void consumed me. My thoughts dissolved, my memories scattered like ashes in the wind. All that remained was the overwhelming presence of the entity, and the role I was destined to fulfill. You are mine. Shoo! The words echoed through the void as I became one with the darkness. The entity's prison began to crack, its bonds weakening as I fed it the power it needed to escape. And as the first fissures appeared, I felt the weight of what I had unleashed, a force that would consume everything in its path, leaving nothing but the void in its wake.